I'm going to call this special meeting to order and welcome everybody. I don't know if we need to do introductions, so I think we'll move right on with the presentation and discussion of the Wichita Places for People plan.
Question, Chairman. We don't have to have a quorum in a special meeting, do we?
We do have to have one, but we've got it.
But we have a quorum, yes.
On a special meeting, I just make sure.
We can't take any action.
We're good.
Today, right?
No,
We're not taking any action.
We're just going to learn about this Wichita Places for People.
It's smart.
Any other questions from the commission before we get started?
All right. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. I'm Mary Hunt from the Planning Department, and welcome for those that were here yesterday. You should all have your binders for the Places for People plan. So today we're going to examine the last two segments, which are zoning and the investment section. What makes these so important is these are the implementation sections of the plan. So the Urban Infill Advisory Committee heard this presentation yesterday, and they have made the decision already to delay their recommendation. They want to study it some more until possibly early December. So December 10th is their next meeting, and they may or may not at that time vote on a recommendation. After that, the commission, after you've had whatever time you need to explore all this, we will ask this body to make a recommendation to the City Council and the Board of County Commissioners, but not until you're ready. So this would amend our community investment plan, which is our comprehensive plan. So this would be an amendment to that. Okay, and why'd we go through this? That Urban Infill Committee met for 2 years. They met 2 years ago this month for the first time. And one of them, of course, is that it is increasingly difficult to maintain all our infrastructure. We have a vast amount of space within our community that underperforms, so we want to help it perform better by focusing on the established central area. And then the other is we want to provide a broader array of housing and neighborhood options for people, because people, they want choice. We compete with other communities for their talent. We compete with them for the skills that people have. We compete for business investment and growth. So we want, I like to say one is offense and one is defense. So the market, it provides us with signals all the time. Our last census, the nation grew by 9.7%, and we grew at just about half that. So we weren't even average in terms of our population growth. And what's interesting about all that is we have good jobs here that we can't fill. So we think if we can be part of that solution in offering other housing and neighborhood options to people, that will make this a more attractive place to be. I have before you at your setting, along with the agenda, was an article that I just pulled it off today on Walmart and how they are they're looking at the kind of things that we're talking about in this plan. So when you have time, take a read on what they're doing, because they're a big player. Investors look at what Walmart does. Developers look at what Walmart does. So they have a voice. So if you have any other questions right now, we'll get on to our presentation. Anybody have a question for me at this time? Okay. All right, so I'd like to welcome back Graham Smith and his team. They'll bring us up to speed on the plan and take us through these last two segments. Okay.
Thank you, Mary.
You bet, thank you.
Too many things here. Good afternoon. My name is Graham Smith. I'm with Gould Evans. My computer is frozen up to where I can't do anything. Apologies. I'm not sure what's going on. There we go. But as Mary said, we're here today kind of at the tail end of our project that we've been working on with the Urban Infill Advisory Committee for about the last 11 months. We started in January engaging the Infill Advisory Committee and had 3 public meetings along the way, and talking to people about what they wanted with redevelopment and development in the established central area. If you remember, what we want to talk to you about today is really bring you up to date on what we've been working on over these last couple of months since we saw you in August, and then really dive into the zoning code update recommendations, which we presented to you. We started presenting to you in August. We made a few tweaks to that and polished some things up and want to make sure you understand those. And then the public investment strategy, which was really the final piece of our project, understanding how public investments can be made to help support future development and some of the tools that are out there to help us do that. Real quickly, our process, as I said, was starting back in January. We started out with a visioning process, asking folks what they wanted to see, how future development, infill, and redevelopment should be done in the ECA, and moved into a community evaluation of your current situation, your current housing stock, your current patterns of development, and the things that support that. Came up with development guidelines in terms of something we called a walkable development book, which is that broader planning effort that really starts to guide the decisions that you all should be making over for the future for infill and redevelopment within Wichita. From that walkable development book that kind of lays out the plan, we made recommendations for updates to the zoning code. Well, let me back up. And that's what we want to go through in some more detail today. And then, as I said, the final piece was that public investment plan. And hopefully, as Mary alluded to, from here, the Urban Infill Advisory Committee will bring forth some recommendations based on the plan, based on our zoning recommendations, and based on the public investment plan to you all to implement into your zoning code and some of your actions moving forward. So if you all have been with us throughout the process, you may have seen this. We've used this from the beginning of the process, and this is where we really started. One of the reasons I think the city wanted to undertake this project was that, not solely for this purpose, but one of the things we found was that Wichita was ranked the 7th best city for car lovers in America. I think that's out of a couple of hundred cities that they looked at in terms of the size of the sample. What we found, and I think what most people know about Wichita, is that the automobile is king, and it is throughout the Midwest. And so you're not that much different than a lot of Midwest cities. But things are starting to shift back to areas within communities that support a more walkable, more intense development pattern to serve people that are desiring that either living or working situation. And that's really what this project is about, is not necessarily mandating that every place in your community be built this way, but allowing this development pattern, the walkable development, compact development pattern, to be built in your community for those that want it, for the market that wants to support it, and allowing those things to happen in your community where they're appropriate. And so we think the plan, the walkable development plan, which was kind of our second piece that we produced, really starts to lay out not only the critical elements of what it takes to create those places, but towards the end of it, it actually identifies how you go about putting those pieces together to create those places. What we want to talk to you about today is how you follow up those recommendations or those ideas in creating those places with some changes to your zoning code that helps create those places. Again, our approach to this right now is not that these things are mandated, but you all may want to look at these in different areas of the community that you do want to say, this is where these things should happen, and we're going to make these things happen in these locations versus other locations that you may not think this is totally appropriate. So that's something that you all, with city staff and with other folks, are going to need to decide how this gets applied. But what we want to show you today is some ideas of how you can change your zoning code to allow these places to happen. And then finally, supporting private development. How can we start to strategically approach our public investments to support private development, to create walkable places where they're appropriate, and to really, as Mary said, build lasting value in your community through the implementation and construction of these different places. So with that, as a pretty brief introduction and kind of recap, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Brewster, who's on our staff at Gould Evans, to talk about the zoning code updates recommendations that we're proposing to you today.
Thanks, Graham. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Brewster with Gould Evans. I'm going to present the zoning recommendations to follow up the walkable development plan. A couple of things I want to touch on that both Graham and Mary talked about. First of all, what we're trying to do is to make sure that the market for these types of projects, which is already happening in your community, we see it, is streamlined to the best. Now it froze up. Hopefully it catches up here. That's streamlined to the best we can. In other words, when we look at zoning in relation to the plan, we're trying to do usually three things. One, identify barriers and impediments and remove them, so at least these things can happen. Two, start to refocus our standards on what are the most crucial standards with regard to the walkable development book. It may not necessarily be more standards, it may be different standards, but we really want to hone in on what are the essential elements of these places that the community's talked about. And then three, get a streamlined process to get them implemented. So removing those barriers, regulating what's crucial and most important, the few things that really matter, and then streamlining a process. So that's our goal for this overall objective.
I have no idea what's going on.
There you go.
Okay, now it seems to be working.
So if you're following along in the book, we're under the zoning tab, and just wanted to touch briefly on our approach to our analysis. Like most communities, your zoning code's based on districts. In other words, large-scale areas that are regulated by one set of standards. And what we're suggesting is we might want to shift more towards a typology-based approach. In other words, there's a lot of different things going on within these districts that add up to these walkable places. The walkable development plan starts to talk about those typologies. And basically, walkable patterns happen when you have as many different things that are compatible with each other going on together. In other words, concentrating trip origins and destinations within a connected pattern. That's it. That's the formula for walkability. So what a conventional zoning ordinance approach would do is take these broad areas and say all of this is under one set of standards and it's a one size fit all. But really in walkable patterns, something like this is usually going on. There's a much more finer grained, there's different things that support each other in close proximity, and so that's sort of what we want to get the code reoriented to. So that's our overall approach, is that a typology-based approach might be better than a district-based approach. And then the plan starts to identify different types of places where different typologies might be available. So regional scale center, much larger scale buildings, much more intense uses, neighborhood hub, very small scale, and not a lot of different things. So it's more, it's kind of expanding your palette of which typologies are available based on which of these place types you're in. And they're all identified in the walkable development book. So those are kind of our marching orders when we analyze your zoning code to see how well it will implement these or not. These are some of the types that are identified in the book. Again, it ranges from your current detached house all the way up to large-scale mixed-use buildings and everything in between. And then this is a concept where we think for walkability in particular, this is one of the areas where we want to focus our standards on what matters most. And from our perspective, it's how do buildings and sites meet the street? How do we balance car space versus people space? That's the tricky part. A lot of our standards aren't geared towards that in the current code right now. We would like to refocus them to those, because if you do these things right, you can make a lot of other things happen without necessarily regulating for it. So that's our approach to frontage types, and I'll go through that a little bit more in detail as we go through as well. So this is an example of what the conventional approach does and why we think this is one of the things we want to address in the zoning recommendations. You find your zoning district, you have a minimum lot size, and then you have building setbacks and height standards that basically determine what you can build. And what happens under those approaches is it's a minimum size, and so the bigger the better, the bigger the more internal flexibility you have, and the bigger often the larger the setbacks are. So you get into a scenario where development is actually encouraged to kind of orient inward and kind of remove itself from the community and public realm under the theory that we're trying to minimize the impacts of development. Whereas in a walkable standard, we want to actually flip it. The smaller scale, the better. The better it relates to the streetscape and public realm, the better off we'll be. So it's really flipping that internal orientation in larger scale into external orientation and smaller scale. So that's the trick we're trying to balance here. Here's an example of things in your community that meet the code. They have that, they meet all of the development standards. They're removing themselves from the public realm, not impacting adjacent sites and all of those things, but it's also just a very isolated project that doesn't contribute to a larger and greater whole. Whereas in a typology-based approach, we would try to find where are the locations where we want to do exactly the opposite. Where are the locations where we want to have many different small-scale things going on and that we want to draw them closer to the street so that things like this can happen. These are buildings that currently wouldn't meet any of your zoning standards except for the CBD area, which has no setbacks and standards with it. So that's an overall quick view of our approach to how we looked at your zoning code. So that approach can be summed up by we view compatibility is based more on the building scale and form than it is on the uses themselves. And we view that design should focus on frontages relating projects to the public realm. And then we view that the places that you're trying to create are going to come from as many different things in a concentrated area as possible so that you're connecting those trip origins and destinations. I'm going to now walk through some of the tables of where we've spotted perhaps some impediments in your current regulations that we would want to look at removing and perhaps replacing with different standards. So I'm going to focus first on the residential part of this. We view, that's a huge part of it. As Mary mentioned, one of the goals is to have as many different housing opportunities and options as you can. And then the idea is, well, figuring out where do they fit into our overall landscape of the ECA. These investments are going to drive the market for walkable centers, walkable commercial areas. Building that housing stock is a key first step. So to get there, we really have three main recommendations that I'll cover in a little bit more detail. Eliminate the density cap. In other words, we feel all of your zoning districts are based on a density number, which doesn't tell us a whole lot about how the development's going to occur. You have the zoning districts we looked at from a residential standpoint where you're primarily your SF5, which is a single family 5,000 square foot lot, TF3 duplexes, and then the three multifamily districts, MF18, 18 units per acre, MF29, 29 units per acre, and then the B district, which goes up to 75 units per acre. A lot of the building types we looked at in the walkable development plan, and you have some existing ones in your community that we've documented, very small scale, 3-story building, 6 units in it on a 5,000 square foot lot. The density number on that building type is anywhere from 40 to 80 units per acre. Even though it's a very small scale, good contributor to the neighborhood, when you do the math on that density, it doesn't fit into any of those districts, or at the very least, it would have to be rezoned to the B district to comply. Well, the B district brings along all of these large scale development standards. So there's our disjoint on the density cap. So removing that. In exchange for that, we do think that there are the limits should be flipped to ensure that we have more smaller scale buildings. So put appropriate limits on the scale of the buildings themselves so that we do get more of the small scale projects that contribute to these vibrant places. So if you're looking on the tables on page 4 and 5, that's being done with a maximum lot width. One of the things to point out is that all of these, well, I'll get to it in a minute when we walk through the tables here. But the last part of our major recommendation is, in exchange for doing this, we do feel that the development standards, they owe an obligation to enhance that public realm if you're improving walkability. So better balance of how you access, where you put the parking, how your frontage and facade is designed to engage the streetscape. That's where we feel that the most standards should be focused on. From there, we have a decision to make of how are we allowing these different types. Is it by right? Is it by context or some limited conditions, or is it through conditional review? And that's what I'm going to walk through now with the residential. So this is a summary of the table that you have on page 4 and 5, and the top half of that table are the residential building types. Going across the top are the zoning districts that I mentioned. In your booklet, these are black squares, would reflect a P that's up here on the screen. In other words, permitted. An open square would be it's somehow a limited or conditional type. These are just an initial recommendations to sort of start the conversation. So there will be some decisions to make of, where do we permit certain types and why. So the first threshold is to say, in our SF5, perhaps we should allow duplex buildings. In other words, it's a house. It's going to be a house, whether it's split into 2 units or 1 unit. It's a similar scale. Can we allow that and add another option in that district? Or do we allow accessory dwelling units, that detached rear building that has a unit in it? You currently do allow that through a conditional review process. So this isn't anything that's introducing anything dramatically new to your zoning ordinance structure. It's just what process will we enable these building types to be built and where. And so there's your first decision point of, are all SF5 districts within the ECA created alike? Is there some other filter we would need to determine where this would be appropriate or not? So then the next threshold up is to say, let's take our 2-family district, the TF3, and say it maybe be appropriate for the next increment up of building types. So this is where we start to introduce new things. So the multi-unit house, a house divided into 3, 4, or 5 units. Row houses, 18 to 24 foot wide buildings, all attached in a single row, or a small apartment building. That's that 3-story, 6 to 12 unit building that I was mentioning earlier that we've seen evidence of. Perhaps that's eligible as the next increment up. Again, you're nothing new that's not in your current zoning ordinance. Right now it says those building types are allowed by conditional use permit, subject to being under 14.5 units per acre. That doesn't give us a lot to go on because we don't really know what 14.5 units per acre looks like. It could be a very large scale building. It's simply a math equation. It doesn't tell us what building type it is. Whereas what we're suggesting is if these standards will tell you that this is a small scale building, it's going to relate well to the streetscape. We know it's going to fit into the neighborhood in certain contexts. So you get a little more assurances rather than just saying, let's do it through conditional review and an abstract number of 14 units per acre is all we'll accept. Trying to get a little more assurances on the scale and form of the buildings that are allowed. Then looking at the next building types up, this is the one where the density cap really kicks in and I think drives things that you actually probably don't want in your ECA area, especially areas that are going to be ripe for walkable development. What these standards tend to do is they make the projects be more viable the larger your parcel. So some of them even would be more viable if you assembled 2 or 3 blocks of your current development pattern, because what the development community is trying to do is they're trying to get to a unit count. So in other words, if I want to build 200 units, I do my math on either 18 units per acre or 29 units per acre, and that tells me how large my parcel size is. And it's going to be quite large to get those 200 units in. Whereas some of these building types could fit those units in a much smaller and compact format. So we are simply ratcheting up the next scale up with the small apartment, mid-rise apartment, and the high-rise apartment. Again, these are things that the standards are based off of your current regulations already. What we're doing is removing that density cap and requiring them to relate well to the public streetscape frontage. One of the other elements that's in the walkable development book and also in our zoning recommendations is this idea of, okay, maybe we don't want to allow these in every situation in all of our existing zoning districts. We can start to take some clues on where they would go. And so perhaps some location criteria, when we look at some of these areas that are more walkable and have a mix of housing, there's really a distinct pattern on where the next increment of building goes. So if you consider the upper left might be a predominantly single family block, perhaps just the corner lots are okay for a duplex or a multi-unit house. The next one over with the twos on it, that's showing some in-grain lots where they're carved up to be much smaller, either for smaller detached houses or oftentimes you'll see row houses aligned along a lot like that. And then we keep graduating up to, well, maybe it's a busy corridor and therefore it's appropriate on the busy corridor, or it's a transition block to our walkable centers or public open space, and those are appropriate for these locations. So those are some additional things that can help you filter where, how, and why we would want to allow these additional building types. And this is just a representative example of a community that reflects all of that. There's a lot of different housing types within a small area, and they're all kind of existing there for a reason. There's everything from small lot houses to large lot houses to row houses to small apartments in this picture, but they all exhibit a similar scale and character, and there's a distinct pattern to where and how you place these building types. And so that's the idea behind getting more housing options in a neighborhood. Feel free to stop in with any questions you might have as well in the middle. I'm going to move on to the non-residential component now. Overall, so this is a summary of our recommendations for the mixed use and commercial part. So those nodes, destinations that people want to walk to. Really the only impediment we find in your zoning code, and this is looking at everything with the exception of your CBD zoning district, that central business district. All of them require I believe it's 20-foot setback, either 20 or 25. I'm getting the residential and commercial confused. 20-foot setback. So there's the biggest impediment, because we know a lot of these buildings address the street, and you have lots of them throughout your community, so you all already know that. However, they're finding a different path to that, either through overlay districts or through the creation of multiple planned districts that are difficult to administer, but somehow getting exceptions. And so our thought is we just need to make that an allowed building type, a building that relates well to the public streetscape, particularly in the ECA, which is an established urban pattern. In doing that, we do think, again, similar to the residential, we allow those to be built to the street, provided they have a pedestrian scale to them. So there's some human scale design details that you want on those buildings that are built to the street. And this will allow that sort of concentration of different uses that create the walkable destinations. And then the last part of it is you do not have any limits on the scale. Again, it's the current code is geared towards the larger the better, but a lot of these mixed use areas and walkable destinations rely on actually having as many small things the better. So a consideration of, do we want to limit the scale of buildings in certain areas so that we don't get one large use that disrupts the walkable pattern. The last element about solving these issues for commercial and mixed use is somehow being more strategic with parking, so that each use doesn't have to provide its own parking on multiple sites and adjacent sites. So looking for ways to reduce that parking count is they're included in our recommendations, and also looking for ways to allow the parking, but allow it to be designed in a way that's more appropriate to walkable context. So you'll see things in a table that are suggesting the larger the parking lot, the more we're going to push it to the back of the site rather than right up on the street. Things like that you have evidence of this going in your community already, but just acknowledging that as a more strategic approach we think could be important. So again, based on the typologies from the walkable plan, there's a similar approach going on here, that part of our recommendation is we could repurpose the NO, neighborhood office, and neighborhood residential districts to make them simply be the ones that are default for these smaller scale types that have street front buildings. Two reasons for that. One, they're both, by their intent, they're clearly intended to be small scale neighborhood oriented uses. And then based on the plan, these would identify nicely with that neighborhood hub, that smallest scale center that's identified in the walkable development plan. The second reason is, in talking with staff, these districts aren't that widely used right now because of some of their other limitations. So this would be an easy one to change the standards, and then going forward, if anyone wanted to implement these patterns, they could rezone to one of those districts, and it would be required then that you build in these walkable patterns. So we look for those leverage points of where is there a district that's not widely used, and we wouldn't be causing any wholesale changes across the community, and then it can be used as the new one going forward. So that's an option for implementing these smaller scale patterns. That gets us up to the small scale mixed use and small scale commercial buildings. The next increment up are these larger mixed use buildings, and again we saw evidence of some of these being built in your community as well. How can we create an easier path for those? And so our thought is, well, they really ought to be allowed in all of the other commercial zoning districts, limited commercial, general commercial, and obviously they currently are in your CBD. The difference here would be we would be putting some specific frontage type and frontage design standards on them to be built to the street. And again, the idea is resulting in places like this. This image has a lot of these building types that we just discussed in here, everything from the small scale storefront to a large grocery store that's just to the top of the site. You can see its parking lot off to the side. All of those components go into a great walkable center that then transitions well to the neighborhood. I wanted to hit a little bit on continuing through the zoning memo, the application of frontage types. Again, this is where we think the design standards need to focus. They don't need to be overbearing. It's simply suggesting that we need to do a better balance of car-oriented parts of our access and design for our sites versus people-oriented. And so how do we do that? So the walkable development book is suggesting that, well, our first, particularly on the residential, it's pretty easy. We can start to tie them to which districts do we allow a type as recommended, and then where do we allow it as limited. So the neighborhood frontage type and the terrace frontage type are what we're suggesting for these ECA neighborhoods. All that's doing is saying limit the extent that's driveway and garage. Oh, and in some cases with this terrace idea, we'll let you bump up even closer to the setback than you currently are. And so we've seen, again, we see evidence of this already occurring in your community, so we're simply trying to codify it and be more strategic with it. As we move on over to the commercial types, this one we feel is more geared towards your streets and the context. So where is it appropriate to build to the street? Where do we want to require it? Where would we want to just simply allow it as an option? Or where would we prohibit it? And so I think Ciara is going to talk a little bit more about the strategic investment side of this and investing in public streets, but there seems to be a logical connection between as some of these streets are repurposed to more walkable patterns, there's where a good opportunity to kick in either a strong suggestion or a requirement that future investment should be building to reinforce those public investments in walkable streets. Yes.
Clarify the difference between the terrace example and the built to street example.
Sure. Right, and again, these are concepts to work with, but the terrace example we're using primarily as a residential type, although you do see commercial uses use it. But basically it's anything that's set back 10 to 20 feet, but that 10 to 20 feet is not used for car access and car-oriented, it's more social spaces. So you do see it somewhat in commercial areas. Perhaps it might be a dining area, outdoor dining area. It might be used in areas where they have grade and therefore the sidewalk can't be built to front the buildings, and so you build a terrace. In the residential setting, it's often used for townhomes, a series of townhomes that have a 10 to 20 foot setback from the streetscape. Whereas the street front one is literally that. It's something that's either built as close or very close to the street, and the public sidewalk becomes the social space for that building type.
Is that similar to, with state laws now prohibiting smoking inside for restaurants, type bars, and so now they're building these little terraces outside with it's fenced in for the restaurants and stuff. Does that play within that whole terrace style?
It certainly could. A lot of times you'll see the other thing. So the courtyard building type, we see some of those in commercial areas as well, where you're just orienting the building to some outside space. So yeah, that there's lots of businesses see value in creating some of these spaces, whether it's for dining, smoking, or something like that, or whether it's just an aesthetic amenity. So yeah, that's a similar concept.
Give me an example of criteria when you say the type of street and how close you're going to be. Are we talking about number of lanes of street? We're talking about the traffic pattern. Talking about speed. We're talking about what is already in the neighborhood in terms of schools.
Right.
What is the formula that comes into place? Says, okay, this would be an area that would really be ideal for a commercial building to be closer to the street.
Right. I don't want to. Sierra's part of the plan went into great detail on different street types. So the book has a whole set of typologies that will talk in depth about that. However, I would say from the planning side, one of the rules of thumb we use is if you have on-street parking, there's a good reason to have the buildings bump right up to the street. One, because the traffic will tend to be slower because of the on-street parking. The pedestrians are buffered from the traffic because of the on-street parking, so you'll have a more walkable pattern to begin with, but also because those businesses rely on parking in the front. So the mismatch we often see is street front buildings where there is no on-street parking. Those kind of can become challenging sites. So a good rule of thumb would be if there's on-street parking, that's a good place to start to think of requiring it. You touched on a few of the others, though, and if it's very high-speed streets, there's still going to be challenges with getting viable businesses in there fronting the street. But certainly wouldn't want to prohibit it because, again, things change over time, streets change. Sierra is going to talk about that. So getting your building stock up to the street in general is just a good thing. I think the harder challenge for us is when we look at all of these walkable centers, all of them have some type of messy uses associated with them. In other words, it's not always everything's built to the street. Often you might find secondary blocks where perhaps a gas station or even the example I had of the grocery store that needs parking in the front. Well, when it's located off on a secondary street and not our A street, pedestrian street, that's fine, and we don't require them to be built up to the street. So that, in our mind, is the trickier part of where do we want to allow them to not be on the street front, and where is it acceptable where it won't disrupt an otherwise pedestrian-oriented pattern. If you think of either Delano or Douglas, those areas really have a good urban form and fabric to it. Where would you allow exceptions to not require them to be on the street? That's the more difficult challenge, and I'll get into what some options we have for that as well. But you're thinking along the right lines on the character of the street is going to determine how development should relate to it. Any other questions on this part of it? So I'm to my summary point, and again, I think what I want to emphasize is a conversation we were having before this meeting. These are recommendations. We know there's some challenges and options and things to consider as you move forward on this, but right now what this memo says is what you should at least consider is that in the SF5 district, perhaps allowing ADUs or duplexes because it's the same scale of building type as the detached house that's currently allowed now. Whether that's based on some of those limited location criteria we talked about, whether it's based on some of the place types identified in the plan. The plan, remember, has these nodes identified, and then from those nodes there's transition areas and edges, and then just the general neighborhood. So perhaps one of the strategies is if the SF5 is in proximity to these places, that might be another option. And that same kind of theory kind of continues up through each of the residential zoning districts. But what I would like to point out is that these aren't really earth-shattering changes. These are all your existing zoning districts, so we're not talking about necessarily remapping. And most of the building type standards, with the exception of the multi-unit house, row house, and small apartment, most of them are following your current standards to begin with. What we're doing is we're adding a little more standards with regards to the scale and form of that building type. So that's the kind of the parallel I would draw. Your TF3 districts, which allows everything that's listed there, allows it right now by a conditional use permit. And the only criteria is it has to be under 14.5 units per acre. What we're saying is we can take that 14.5 units per acre and define it based on these building types, and maybe it's even higher than 14.5 units per acre, but now we know each of those building types will fit better into the neighborhood. So then your decision point is, do we allow it by right? Do we allow it only in certain conditions that we can actually identify what those conditions are? Or do we still need to rely on a discretionary conditional review process to allow it? So that type of theory rolls through all of the residential recommendations. Again, on the commercial side, what we're really looking at doing is removing the setbacks so that you can have a good street front building, requiring some design standards to make sure it's human scale, and from there, and perhaps limiting the scale of buildings to smaller scale buildings rather than allowing them all to be large scale. From there, your options are, okay, can we take that NO and NR district and repurpose them? So those become the districts that are, you're required to build this way, and it's your option to rezone to it. Are there areas in all of our commercial districts where we just want to simply allow this to be built to reflect some of the existing patterns? From there, are there areas where we'd actually want to require it to be built, or on the flip side, prohibit the opposite to be built? So I think there are some legitimate discussion points there. And then the last part is we would see this, currently a lot of this is being done through a planned zoning process. In other words, we take an area, whether it's developer initiated, whether it's neighborhood association initiated, or whether it's city staff initiated, we take an area and we do a more detailed plan where we can go block by block and determine where these types are appropriate. We would see these typologies that we're building in here to be basically the puzzle pieces for that type of effort, so that you're starting from a basis rather than just starting from scratch on these planned zoning districts. Any questions on any of those approaches or what we're recommending?
Explain a little bit. If you'd explain a little bit in more detail, you mentioned early on the concept of streamlining the process, and on certain things that we do relative to zoning and stuff, the statutes are going to control the timing on that and meetings and stuff. Describe that a little bit more, please. Sure.
Good question. So these tables here are probably the best example. So anything that's a P or an L, we're suggesting we could actually build the standards into the code that make this acceptable. So each of these building types has specific lot coverage, height standards, and then the frontage types are defining how that building needs to relate to the streetscape. So by making it a P, in other words, it's permitted, or making it an L, it's limited, but we've listed where it's limited to based on these criteria. Technically, then they would not have to go through a long public process to get that built. It would be more administrative, or perhaps it's just a planning commission review without a public hearing to make sure those conditions are met. So there's a way of streamlining it. Now, obviously, to make that change, all of that has to go through the public hearing process to get those standards into your code. But if they're built into your code, technically those projects can start to happen a lot easier. Whereas right now, on a few of those districts, it's all a public hearing and a discretionary process, and it's a lot longer.
More questions, if you'll indulge me. You'd mentioned pages 4 and 5, and I'm looking at a footnote here on one of the tables, and it says disregard front setback standards. The frontage type not regulates the setback as well as other design features. Can you explain that one a little bit more?
Yes, so the table again, trying to stay as true to your current standards as possible. The table for front setback lists what's currently there. So for example, if you look at the detached house up through the duplex, what we're saying is in walkable neighborhoods, we aren't saying it's a minimum setback of 25 feet. We'd be saying it's a setback of 10 feet to 50 feet. And in exchange for doing that, you need to be designing that frontage according to one of the frontage types. So it's trying to say we're shifting from our current zoning approach of setbacks to basing it on the frontage. So we're capturing your current standards, but then saying we'll allow you to deviate from those standards if you design based on these frontage types that are then followed up later in the table.
One final question is item number 4 on page 8. It's referring to walkable development overlay district. And says the application of this overlay should be both optional, allowing building types and so forth. And the question I've got there is if you're going to achieve this, why would you want it optional? Why wouldn't you go ahead and set up an overlay district relative to the nodes that have been identified? And that way staff has clear direction that that's what's going to happen in those areas.
Could you repeat the page?
He's working off the former draft.
Okay.
He is giving him the current one here. I think the question he's asking is about, in the current version is on, I've got a hole through the page number. It's the top of page 15, item D.
Yeah. So it's saying,
Item D?
Yeah, item D at the top of page 15 is where it is in the current draft. It's still the same language and same recommendation. It's just not on page 8 anymore.
Right. Yeah. Graham's reminding me of the conversations we had that when you do apply one, I think that gives you the further level of planning to know exactly where you're going to require or not. So when these go into place, you'll have better assurances of that's more of that kind of block by block area I was talking about. So for example, in the Delano area, it'd be very easy to identify the 4 or 5 blocks where you have to have street front buildings, and then the other blocks maybe it's optional. So I think that the overlay would tell you that which areas are required and which are optional. And then the other part of it is we didn't want to preclude it in areas that weren't under the overlay, so it would be optional there as well, that you could build to the street, but you wouldn't necessarily have to.
But would the overlay be in place such that it protects that area or node, and you don't end up with missing teeth in the overall process?
Yes, that would obviously be the goal. That overlay should identify those areas where it's critical that you don't have missing teeth, right?
Well, as this group tries to come up with a zoning code based on these recommendations, would it behoove us to go through the city to see, well, this area should be like this and this area should be like that? Because it's so varied. I mean, I look at Delano and then I look at Indian Hills and Benjamin Hills.
Yeah, I do think it is varied, but the patterns and the things that are in the development book are all pretty simple and familiar. So I don't think it has to be overly complex. I think again, I go to probably the more difficult part are in your well-established single-family areas that might be zoned CF SF5, yes, you might want to be more cautious of what additional things you're enabling there. In the other areas, I think what these typologies are doing is they're allowing lots of things that are going to reinforce the character of those areas to happen. So I think it could be more easily administered on the residential side. With the commercial side, my gut instinct is it does take a I think the easiest thing to do is to just simply allow it to be built to the street, provided you meet these good frontage conditions. What you might be walking into is a scenario where you do have a street front building on a busy street without on-street parking, but that's certainly not any worse than what you're getting now. I think the bigger challenge is where do you want to require it, and where would you actually prohibit buildings from being set back? And we can't do it at a confidence level on this scale. We could start to key it maybe towards when you do invest in these walkable streets, but my gut instinct is you need to do either neighborhood association or development sponsored or city sponsored plans where you can start to implement this. It doesn't take a lot of detailed analysis. You can almost go to each of these areas and pick out the 5 or 6 blocks that you want to be the heart of the place and put that in. So I think coming up with a system that allows you to go through some of the place types in the plan and start ticking them off could help you do that. Yes.
Starting to touch on the question that I had, and it's more a political question. I like the flexibility of mixed use, single family and multifamily in close proximity together. We run across it all the time when a new subdivision is coming in right next to an existing subdivision that's got single family homes, and the folks come out of the woodwork that we're going to destroy their way of life by allowing this to come in. If we incorporate this, that we allow this mixed use, what is the process that says, okay, this neighborhood is going to allow this, and what process the people that are already living in the area have? I mean, when are they going to have their say? Because and who makes that decision? Is that a city council decision, or what's the process that this gets put into place?
So a couple things with that. One, these recommendations are targeted to the ECA to begin with, so we wouldn't expect them to be applied outward for new development. So the ECA has what we would call good bones for these patterns to work well. So the second part is that none of them are going to happen until you go through the full kind of public hearing process of figuring out which strategy is best, and is it a ECA-wide strategy, or is it a more nuanced strategy like some of the things we talked about? And so that will require notice, public hearings, and the Planning Commission will make a recommendation to the governing body on what to adopt. So there's the second checkpoint. What I mentioned about the established single-family areas, I do think it would be wise to carefully scrutinize where, when, and how we would want to do this, because I don't think it's necessarily a one-size-fits-all for those areas. However, I think you already have the places mapped with regard to TF3, MF18, and MF29 districts. You have those mapped, and I wouldn't see that as being as large of an obstacle, because what we're really doing is we're allowing these smaller scale building types in exchange for greater densities. I think these patterns are probably more appropriate for the area than what your current code would require in these areas. So I think that change would be a little less disruptive to what's going on right now.
Speak a little bit about, if we want to try to encourage more dense development, how does that benefit the developer? I mean, would we be able to say that, it's more efficient to build in this, and if so, by how much? I mean, there needs to be some, to a developer, this may look like it's too difficult to deal with. I don't want to mess with it. can we say with some certainty it's going to be more efficient? It's going to be more cost effective to build in areas that maybe need redevelopment, who have empty lots. You know, we have a lot of empty lots around the city that need to be. What's the incentive here for the developer? Does that mean, obviously, you know, when you get to cities of the size of Kansas City, Chicago, all those places, you know, land cost becomes a really big variable and a driver of lots of things. That's really not the case in Wichita. I mean, compared to those places, land cost is not the major driver of these things, which in other places pushes up the density just because the land is so expensive. So are there other efficiencies here that would encourage, and how might the city or these regulations encourage people, especially in these infill areas? You know, if you go to some of these established neighborhoods, as Mr. Warren said, we may get a lot of pushback. There may be other neighborhoods that really need, in order to maintain their viability, places that don't have the retail services they'd like to have. And the reason for that is a developer looks at it and says, yeah, I got enough people in here to do this. Right. And so how do we encourage that? Is in your experience, is it way more efficient to build this way? Is it less of, yeah, because we got multi-stories. I'm not sure when you get into elevators and all those other kind of things, but
right. A couple of different angles on your question. The first one to the developers' efficiency and whether they'll be attracted to this or not. What we find is the processes, in other words, time. That's always very costly to them. And then also when you're in a discretionary process where we haven't identified what we're trying to achieve, that presents risk. So those two things will make developers stay away from projects. Looks risky. I don't have good expectations for what I can build, and it's going to cost me a lot of time before I even know whether I can build or not, and I may even have to put design or professional services towards some concepts before I can even get to the table to see whether I'd be approved or not. So we're trying to eliminate those barriers as much as we can. In other words, set up some expectations for these typologies. Really all we're asking them to do is, on the residential side, is to have some neighborhood scale to your building. In other words, don't build just this huge building, and have a good frontage that respects the streetscape. Those are the two standards that we're adding in new. In exchange for that, we're saying you could have an expedited process, whether this is administratively approved or just a planning commission review rather than a full-on public hearing and discretionary review. And you also have some expectations for what we're trying to design too. So those two things should eliminate the procedural impediments, which can be quite significant, I think, to what you hit on. With regard to efficiencies of economies of scale, can I build this? In other words, is it a viable project? We do think that a lot of the density numbers are presenting some substantial barriers to this. We haven't done market assessments or no construction costs, but essentially for doing those two things we're asking them to do, we're taking a parcel that could maybe get 2 or 3 units on it to one that can now get 10 or 12 units on it. So that can't do anything but help if there's any other cost or construction barriers out there. I think the third part of your question, and it is exactly and Mary touched on this, of the efficiencies of getting more people into this area are going to do two things. They're going to drive further commercial development, and they're going to help get property contributing to the overall maintenance and infrastructure of the area. Whether these are building types and a scale of building that we, to be honest with, the development industry hasn't done a lot of recently. So we have this sort of predisposition to bigger and bigger scale. So there is I think a skill and sort of aptitude barrier that we need to overcome and start nurturing some of these smaller scale projects, row houses, fourplexes, small apartment buildings. They're just not built a lot, partly because we have these procedural and regulatory barriers, but partly because the industry's sort of gone on a different path. So that's a tougher one to crack, but I think eliminating the procedural costs and barriers and giving additional development value for doing these few extra things will get us a good way there.
Tag on to what Lowell said, it looks like what we're doing here at the base is tweaking or potentially changing the zoning codes. Are we also talking about taking a radius of 1 mile or 2 miles of the downtown area and saying, this is what's going to go here and that's what's going to go there? I think that at some point along the line in this, we need to get input from some developers to see if we can come up with the greatest plan in the world, but if nobody's interested in doing it, it doesn't make any difference.
Yeah, that's true. So to answer your first part is the walkable development book starts to identify target areas, and that's this map up here is sort of the root of it. These, you can see there's...
Can we identify exactly where you find the walkable development book? Because it's referred to throughout here. And, you know,
It's called development, the white tab.
I think it's called development on my tab as well, but I just wanted to clarify that because it's throughout this whole thing, we talk about the walkable development book, but we don't have it labeled as such in the book, okay?
Okay.
So I would encourage you to, you know, under table of contents, put at the very top of that says, this is the walkable development book, because we don't say that. It's kind of a mystery until you read this about 3 times where it is. So so if you want to refer to that, that's under the development tab, and it has a number of, you know, it's got 110 pages or so in it. So,
Right.
and that's where you find the resource material, as I would understand it. 116 pages in it. So anyway, sorry to interrupt you, but I think
No.
it's important for people to understand where that piece of it is. It's not a separate book, it's a chapter in here, or it's a tab, as Scott said, yeah.
So a couple of items. One, during the process, early on in the process, we've been working with our Urban Infill Advisory Committee, which does have a few developer types on it. And also we had some initial small group discussions and interviews with members of the development community. And so some of their thoughts and ideas are reflected in the walkable development book. With regard to the places we've identified on the map up here have either been identified because they have some remnant of a walkable development pattern left in them, or have some of the other attributes that you would like to find in there that you can build from. And so these are conceptual locations in nature with regard to size and scope and those types of things. But they are areas that we feel like there are things there that you can build upon. And so those should be some early targets to get started. I think the last time we met with you all, or maybe it was with the Urban Infill Advisory Committee, is what we're showing here as far as locations and the potential development in those locations is more than a lifetime of work for anybody. If you could pick out 3 or 4 of these areas over the next 5 to 10 years and really start to hone in on some of those things and make those more walkable areas, you'd have a tremendous amount of success for your entire community. And so what the walkable development book does is, what are those critical elements that should be put in place in these areas? To tie into the question about, is it 1 mile or 2 on each side of downtown? I think one of the ideas is that this is a target map, that some of those areas you should be focusing on as a community. The other tool that I would point to is that overlay district. Some of these areas you may want to be proactive, define an overlay district, define the standards that are a part of that overlay district, and target some of those areas proactively to say, here's the rules that we're now going to operate under with regard to development in this area. Part of what we were talking about earlier is you take that overlay district and allow people to use that in areas they deem appropriate for that type of walkable development. So I think there's what we tried to do with the walkable development book is give you the criteria and identify locations and a process to create these places. The zoning recommendations are our initial shot at looking at your current zoning code, identifying some shortcomings in creating walkable areas and trying to fill those gaps in. So hopefully we've given you a lot of different ways to go about this. And it's up to you all, talking with your city staff and your elected officials, to figure out the best way to approach this.
Follow-up comment related to the development industry is I've been really impressed since I've been able to be on the Planning Commission how developers, they get it. We're charged to have a conversation on these unique concepts and things. For example, multifamily. It's been going great. They've been meeting the needs for that on it. Same thing, how many cases on TF3 and, duplex and things do we have? So, and Old Town and some of these other suburban commercial developments. So what I think is really good about this is we're raising the concepts of things that are being talked about, and we're fine-tuning it. And we're finally looking at it in the detail level that it needs and begin to build that concept. And I'm confident, based upon my experience, the development industry will find a way to make things work on it. So, having lived here 55 years, I applaud your diagrams here. I think you guys have done a really good job of making the assessment, finding these nodes and things. I'm getting to a question. And the question is, over time, what kind of measures would you use to assess the validity of this concept? Do you go back and start measuring BMI with people? Do you look at assessed valuation? Do you look at densities? How do you know that this is working?
That's a great question. I think just on a superficial level, counting permits, how many new permits do you have, would be one way to start knowing whether it's working on drawing investment. We had a conversation this morning on Mary's point of, part of the overarching goal here is the community's calling for more housing options. When we think of that globally, it's fairly easy to think, well, we have options. You can find just about any type of housing you need here in Wichita. What we're talking about is options within a area where people have either diversity of types for the benefits it provides to that broader context, or I could live in this same area despite my housing needs changing over time, and therefore I'm really invested in that area. So at the other end of the superficial scale, to measure what planners are interested in, I would think some kind of measure of our housing diversity, how many different types do we have within certain areas, might be a really good scale to see, over time, how did this area fill in. I do think on the whole ECA, there's probably also a measure of how many of these places that are on this map right here can we see new investment in, and it probably won't be all of them, and if it were half of them, it would probably be a good thing. They're all going to get some level of investment, but how much of it is hitting the mark of the walkable development book?
The only different thing that really comes to my mind is the amount of street activity, the people using the public investments that you're going to make in your community, walking on the sidewalk, biking on the bike lanes. And then ultimately, probably you would see, based on some of the things Chris said and the activity in the area, you're going to start to see property values rise, which in the ECA, there's quite a few areas that could use that. And so I think getting back to using the bones, the structure that was originally put in place to support development, but also support the people living in those neighborhoods in a more walkable fashion would drive the value of the place.
Mary, do we have the availability to have an online map? Can we pull up Google Maps here and look at one of these nodes or not? and I want to talk about for a minute the commercial side of this, and the big node you have there in the northeast quadrant is the Wesley Hospital area at Central and Hillside.
I'm sorry, right there. Well,
Yeah, yeah, that one there. And if we had the ability to pull that up on Google Maps and look at it, and I'm looking at it here, and so this, as he said, I'm going to get to a question eventually. When we look around, here's a what I would call a captive audience of employees that have had to park in a parking garage, and in theory is difficult for them to get in their car and go someplace. They may have limited lunch hours, that sort of thing, okay? And when I look at around that area, I'm going to read some names to you here. McDonald's, Jimmy John's, Chipotle, Spangles, Walgreens, Panera Bread, Pizza Hut, Hog Wild Pit Barbecue. A number of these have footprints that corporate won't let you build unless you do this. I mean, and every one of these I read is surrounded by parking. Not a one of them is on the street. So how do you get over that? I mean, here we have all these employees supposedly that can walk and go get lunch, but every one of these things is not connected. It's surrounded by parking, and it's extremely congested and not very friendly to pedestrians because of the width of the streets and those kind of things. Well, there's a map. Can you zoom that? We're getting closer.
can I control that? I can't control that.
Can you zoom it?
Is it on the big screen in front of you?
It's on the big screen, but
Mouse is underneath.
there you go. Where am I going here?
Whoops.
Yeah, he's got the location right.
It,
Pan too far left. There you go. That's to your right. And it's further south.
Central Hillside.
Central and Hillside.
Central Hillside, Wesley Hospital.
Yeah. We're getting closer.
on the hillside. So, the image that I had up on the screen as you were still talking that I changed from the map to that image of Starbucks and the strip center, which is a relatively new strip center. That is this corner right here. It's been redeveloped since, but it is immediately catty corner from Wesley. So to your point exactly, the development that you're seeing in that quadrant is surrounded by parking. And
So how do you?
my
you know,
initial response to the question
Yeah.
is that's what they're allowed to build.
well, I understand, but how do we?
The path of least resistance.
How do we
So-
encourage a walkable development here? Because of all the places I can think of which have enough demand to have a walkable development, this would be it. You know, here's a, if you will, as best of any place in town, a permanent set of employees that are captured.
Yeah.
And yet, there's nothing walkable around this thing. You know, except for a walkway between two buildings that goes from the hospital to an office building.
Yeah.
And so, you know, have other cities overcome this in some ways? I mean, how do you say to a Walgreens, put the parking in the back or you can't go here?
So a couple of initial thoughts. In this image, I would the first thing I would observe is the size of the streets.
Yeah.
And we just drove this morning. Actually, we drove through this area this morning. The speed at which traffic moves, and I think if I can zoom in more without messing this up. Your pedestrian space is immediately adjacent to your travel lanes. There's no buffer. There's no separation. It is one of, I won't go that dramatic on you guys, but it is an inhospitable environment for people to walk. So people aren't going to walk. I would venture to guess though, there's probably quite a few people that walk from the hospital to Jimmy John's and
There
kind
are,
of dodge
sure.
traffic, play Frogger across the street to get
Right.
to
Right.
those places. I think the first thing to do, and Sierra will talk about it here in a minute, is we need to change the public realm to a more hospitable environment for people to use outside of a 4,000-pound appendage that they have to carry around with them called the automobile. So that's idea number one. What we've seen in a lot of places, because actually, if any of you are familiar with KU Med in Kansas City, Kansas, up in the Kansas City area, what they've done immediately across the street from their hospital is push everything to the street. All the outdated pad sites, well, not all of them, there's still a couple left, but they've taken 2 solid blocks and moved everything up to the street and built, I think it's 4 or 5 stories. Part of one block is retail on the first floor that's doing pretty good with a hotel above. The other block is retail on the first floor with some office, I think medical office and things like that above, and maybe even some apartments and some of that. The retail's a little slow on the take. It's got a similar situation. It's only 4 lanes. It doesn't have on-street parking, but it has a wider public realm that makes it a little more comfortable to walk in. So those are some of the things. But they have a similar captive market of like 8,000 people every day. So it can be done. But I would argue that the first thing that needs to happen is a change in the public realm to encourage people to do that. The other option is this could be an area that is absolutely ripe for an overlay district, that you require them to do that. If you're going to do that, though, you need to respond with similar, or what we just talked about, those public realm improvements that make that development pattern usable and encouraged.
Well, have you seen anybody, one of the problems with pedestrians on these large intersections is you push the light, okay? You push the button, and all it does is tell you when nobody's turning left. I mean, you have no protection whatsoever. I see people do this on bicycles all the time. They think they have protection when they push that button. The only way to have protection is to stop traffic from all directions and let people cross. Is anybody doing? We used to do that at various intersections, and everybody kind of got away from it. Do you see that happening anywhere else where you actually have? Because to get across 2 of those, you really take your life in your hands because the last thing people are looking for, number 1, it's their cell phone. Number 2, it's the steering wheel. And about 4 down the line is there anybody on the street? And so everybody knows that. So the only way you can do this is to absolutely stop the traffic. And then we still have right turns on red, which in this town means right turns on the roll. Okay, nobody stops on a red, and well, okay, John does. That John, yeah, not the other John. So, do you see that happening other places as well in terms of trying to protect the pedestrians?
You quickly got out of my realm, so I'm going to turn it over to our bike and ped expert. So.
I will say I don't know of examples in the Midwest, but on the East Coast, like in Boston, they do that where all the traffic signals go red and it's called a pedestrian scramble. And you can cross diagonally wherever you want. So the strut man says go and the red lights come up for traffic. So it does happen. And it is a tool that could be in the toolbox. Yeah, and I would say a different project we're working on for the city is a marked crosswalk policy. And so I was trying to take a picture of someone using a mid-block crossing, and I literally, at lunch, was out in front of Panera just waiting for someone from the hospital to use that signal to cross the road. And guess what? I do not have a picture. So testify. It's not a hospitable place to cross.
Well, and one of the other issues is we've taken Douglas and said, we'll do everything possible to keep you from driving down Douglas. We've got diagonal parking. We pushed out the curbs. We've done all that. So what we've done is we've pushed traffic to these peripheral streets. It's easier to go down Central than it is Douglas now. And so we reap some of the benefits because we're trying to push more traffic down Central than we used to. And it's not helping this area here, certainly because of that. So you kind of rob Peter to pay Paul sometimes with these issues going on.
Sometimes people move to the path of least resistance.
Well, that's exactly what's going on here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Can Jim flip it back to?
Oh, there we go.
So we can continue the discussion on the zoning in a little bit, but we wanted to get through the second piece, which was the public investment strategy piece, and CR is going to take that.
Yeah, so my name is C.R. Schlichting, and I'm with Tool Design, and our main role in this project is creating strategies to create multimodal streets that support this walkable development. So in terms of the portion of the public investment strategy that I'll talk about is how can we create these walkable streets that support the land uses that we desire, and they talked about with the zoning code updates. So in terms of walkable streets, what I'm going to talk about is what improvements are desired. What do they cost? That was a question the city had. What would some typical cost be for creating these multimodal walkable streets? What sort of funding is available? And then from the city side, how do we get these improvements programmed? So in great detail in the development tab, I won't say walkable development tab, in the development tab is a large section on different street types. I'm just going to provide a summary here. And so what we did is sort of simplify there are some street types in the downtown plan, as well as some street types in the street design guidelines. And so we created 6 different street types that really reflect the land use context along with the function of the street. So for example, Douglas is an arterial, but Douglas changes dramatically in its land use character as you go from, even west of Delano, through Delano, downtown, out to the design district, and beyond. I mean, it's an arterial, but again, the land use context changes. So we came up with 6 different street types, and these then relate to the types and levels of investment in walkability. So there's the mixed use Main Street. Douglas is a great example of that. There's a mixed-use connector. Think of maybe East Harry, where the land use is some residential, some commercial, even some industrial. There's also a residential neighborhood on the bottom left. So I think about how, First and Main headed south of downtown, are pretty wide arterials, but the land use context is so different down in South Central, where it's more residential, than it is in downtown. And we want to have different strategies for what that street, how it should function based on the land use character. There's also residential connectors that are largely residential uses, not as much commercial. So maybe like Oliver, but they still move a lot of traffic. And then also active alley, the gallery alley, and repurposing some of those uses to have some desires for what that would look like. And then also plaza streets. Plaza streets really refer to the streets of Old Town, where it's a much more narrow, shared space between people walking and biking and traveling. And so these street types are a tool that staff can use when they're working on neighborhood plans, on corridor plans, reviewing development proposals to say, hey, these are the characters of the streets that we want. And so in many ways, it's visionary. We're not going to go through as part of this project and label every street in its street type, because that would be very onerous, and you'd want the neighborhood to be involved in that too, and sort of what is the land use character that you want and what is that street type. So walkability is so much more than just having a sidewalk. A sidewalk is the bare bones of what you need. But there's other things that are needed to make the streets be safe and comfortable. I like to use the analogy of when you're in your car provides seating, it provides shade, it might even provide your trash receptacle. But when you're out walking, you need trees for shade, you need bus shelters for shade. You actually need that trash receptacle and lighting. And so there's just things that the public street needs to provide to have a place be really walkable. And so what we did is we said, for these different street types, what are those sidewalk zone elements that are needed? Now this is part of the investment tab in your book if you want to follow along, and it's on page 12, because I know these tables are a little small, especially for folks that are in the back. So the picture down here again is that mixed use connector. Think of, you know, Douglas in Delano or other places. And that really has all the elements. You know, it's got trees, it's got benches, it's got pedestrian scale lighting. There are some bus shelters, you got your trash bins. You have all those different things for this really walkable place. And that would be the core of those nodes, the circles that we saw on the map that Graham had up here. As you move to the residential connector streets, again, then you need a little less. You know, you probably don't need special bike parking. You're probably not going to have bus shelters because the transit service isn't as frequent. Then when you go to the residential neighborhood street, these quieter streets, you know, that's really trees and lighting. You're not going to have benches and bus shelters and bike parking there. And so it really scales the investment back based on the character of the street. And plaza streets are on the chart and active alleys as well, but it's just that concept of what's sort of needed for these different street types. And then we use this to build our cost estimates as well. So one of the questions I thought you might have is, you know, how we have our existing right-of-way. How do we do all of this with the land that we have? Because we were talking about the established central area, has a good street grid pattern. We're not really talking about building new streets, but we're looking at really, if you will, redeveloping the streets at the same time we're redeveloping the land. And so the idea here is that not to have large street reconstruction projects, which are very expensive and take a while to get programmed, but to use the assets we have there and reprogram the space. So for this example, it could be removing or narrowing motor vehicle lanes, removing maybe parking on one side. And what that does is it allows you to move the curb lines in. So if you will, imagine that the curb line on this street used to be between these two green shades. So similar to Central or Hillside, assume that sidewalk used to be right at the back of the curb, which on a rainy day today, you're gonna get splashed and all sorts of things. It's just not comfortable. And so in theory, with this, imagine it used to be that 5-lane arterial, but we've analyzed that those 2 lanes aren't absolutely necessary. And so we're able to move the curb line in, and in this case, create a nice buffer for that sidewalk. And this example also has bike lanes. If parking was very important, you know, there could be parking there instead of the bike lanes. And so again, it's redeveloping the streets that we have in simpler ways than tearing up the entire street to reconstruct it. There is one street type that does require reconstructing the street, and that would be like if you're doing new streets in Old Town, that is a full reconstruction and, you know, turning some dirt roads into brick roads and such. And so that is actually one of our, the most expensive, if you will, examples. So this next chart is on page 11, and taking that example of the residential connector street, what this X in the box says is, you know, how are we going to improve this type of street? It really would be adjusting the curb lines. So moving those curb lines in a little bit to add that space. If there wasn't a sidewalk there, the ECA has a pretty good intact sidewalk network. They're not everywhere. And also to add that amenity zone or that buffer zone. And then this table shows the different ways that we would do that for the other streets. But again, it's really reallocating the existing space that is out there. The next chart is on page 12. So in addition to, something that's very important for creating walkable development and walkable streets is traffic calming. You know, slowing the cars down and so that it's more comfortable. I think about sitting outside by a fast-moving street with high speeds and cars are whizzing by. It's noisy, it's not enjoyable, it's not a place you want to be. But if the streets are a bit more calmed and people are maybe actually going just the posted speed limit, that would make things a lot better. Right, I'll admit when I come to Wichita, I try not to rent a car because I walk the talk, but I rented a car this time because I had to go to a lot of meetings. And so I'm driving along, the person who tells you, you know, like speed is bad. And I'm just, all of a sudden I was going 40 in a 30-mile-an-hour zone. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is horrible. But it's just that the street is so wide and everybody else is going fast. It's just designed to go quickly. So there are traffic calming techniques. One of them has been implemented on Douglas with the curb extensions, which is the photograph on the screen here. And what's important for Wichita too is to pilot things before you put the concrete down. So the flexible posts went out first. We tested it out. Whoever decided it was a good idea put them in, and that's a huge improvement for the walkability along Douglas. There's a shorter crossing distance to get across, and as a pedestrian, you are so much more visible because you're out there where you used to be back behind the parking lane. So that's just one example of how you can test some of these ideas before they go in. Another one too is refuge islands. So if there is this 5-6 lane road, provide a space halfway in there that if you get stranded, you have a comfortable space to wait. You have a push button as an escape to get across. And also just having a median kind of causes that friction that helps slow down some of those speeds. So again, this is a table that helps us with our cost estimates as well. This next table is a doozy. It's on page 13. But what this lists is all of the estimates or the assumptions that went into the cost estimate. So how frequent would the lighting be? How frequent is the spacing of the trees and trash receptacles and such? And so all of those details are there so you can check our math and see what we included as assumptions for the cost estimates. So what we did is create the cost estimates based on a block versus a mile, because we see these being pretty, ideally smaller scale projects. And so if we're talking Central and Hillside, you're probably not going to change the street for miles and miles, but you're going to work on a couple of blocks. And you might decide that maybe the more walkable part should be sort of on the east side of Hillside, where Panera is and the hospital is. And so in an area where it's easier to narrow the streets, you'd have to make hard decisions too about, do you need all of those left-hand turn lanes and right-hand turn lanes? Because what those turn lanes do is make traffic move faster and make it easier for traffic. But what it doesn't do is provide that buffer for the pedestrians and that shorter crossing distance. And a lot of this comes down to trade-offs and negotiating and deciding what the priorities are in these areas that are identified for being more walkable. So I won't go into the cost estimates in detail, but they range anywhere from, again, reconstructing Old Town streets is a bit more expensive, upwards of over $1 million, versus doing some of the smaller rehab work on residential streets is, maybe more like $200,000 per block. I mean, not small amounts of money, but the type of money that would be needed to make these investments. So talking about investments, it's another beautiful large chart. It's on page 16. This was a funding source chart that we first put together when we were working on the pedestrian master plan here in Wichita about 5 years ago, and we've since updated it. And so going from right to left, the other funding, some of it could possibly be public-private partnerships. So as you're working with developers, doing your deals for this type of development, there may be some things that they're able to offer in terms of these sidewalk zone elements with trees and things. And then there is also, sorry, I lose my notes here. The next side is going the less lighter blue, the private foundation money or just private money. Downtown Wichita, they fund a lot of things that make downtown very walkable, including the queue line. And so there is some, private investment that can help walkability and the different improvement districts that exist out there to help pay for the lighting and benches and the things that go above and beyond what's normally provided. The next funding sources are federal money. So there's federal money out there, but it is very, very competitive, and it also comes with requirements for local matches. But communities are getting more creative with the federal funding that they seek for, like, HSIP is the Highway Safety Improvement Program. Traditionally, communities have used this money for making roadway improvements for motor vehicles, turn lanes, widening and such. But some communities now are saying, hey, safety improvements are related to making the place better for people walking and biking. And so this HSIP money, in some communities, it's starting to be used for pedestrian crossing enhancements and things of that nature. So sometimes thinking just in different ways of how to use these funding sources. You'll notice there's no state bucket. KDOT doesn't have any dedicated money for walkability, walking or biking projects, but the money that WAMPO gets from KDOT, they have created programs. You know, this money comes from KDOT to do this project. And so the city has already prioritized some of that money that they do get from KDOT for walking and biking projects. And then the last funding source, which is local funding, as somebody pointed out at Urban Infill, you're talking about our property taxes, which is true, is the city's own capital improvement program. And so there's two different types of projects. There's standalone projects. I will say there are not a ton of just standalone walking related projects, but there is now a line item for walking and biking in the capital improvement program. Another way that walking can be enhanced is through what we call routine accommodation. There's a lot of street projects in the capital improvement program, and so the city does have a multimodal policy. They have street design guidelines, and so the city has tools that they can use to look at these street projects and say, hey, how could we enhance walkability? It's really a matter of prioritization. And so the city, as I understand it, has some new criteria they're using for how a project gets programmed for the capital budget. And I think it'd be great to take a look at that criteria, and after it's been used a couple of years, and say, you know, are we getting sort of walkable development projects out of this? You know, maybe we need to tweak the criteria for ranking the projects that go into the CIP to make sure that some of them do have those walkable components. So some examples of projects here. So First Street through Old Town just got redone, and that was more of, I'll call it like a partial street reconstruction. They didn't, you know, tear up the street from building face to building face, but they did enhance the sidewalks on one side of the street. There was some, you know, mill and overlay, repaving, and they also did the curb extensions. If you can see close enough, the other side of the sidewalk wasn't touched in some areas, so it was really just enhancing and redeveloping the street in the areas that need it. Another option is kind of similar to the temporary curb extensions on Douglas was, you know, the bike lanes that we see downtown on Main and First and Second and such. Those were done by just repurposing or reallocating the space in the existing street to make way for bike lanes. And that's, of course, a cheaper way of doing things. It doesn't come without cost. There's still process and paint and restriping that's needed. But I think it's a good example for how you can do some of these things without huge capital investments. So with that, I'll turn it over to Graham.
I have a question for you. Yeah. So back on your street types where you have low estimate and high estimate, I think you might want to add in maintenance. Because one thing that, like a 5 to 10 year maintenance, because I've seen, and the city's doing a great job with this same thing, with the little things that come out in the street, and they're using the mixed use of brick and concrete. But we've seen this in the last 5 years, they're doing the same thing in our area. But now we have checkerboard crosswalks, because instead of replacing the bricks whenever flooding or they crack, they just put black tar in it. So now we have checkerboard. So that's why I'm seeing that. And then also when they come in and they redesign and put these trees in, and then there's no water in there, or if businesses aren't watering them, then the trees die out within probably 1 to 2 years.
Right.
Same thing with the flowers and the potters.
Yeah.
So just a maintenance for the next 5 years, you gotta have to think about that also.
Right, yeah, because we didn't include maintenance costs. I mean, we mentioned that we didn't include maintenance costs, but that is definitely a cost to the city for maintaining paint and flowers and lights and the such. Yep.
I've got a question on traffic of what do you think about one-way streets and safety for pedestrians?
Yeah, so one-way streets, I mean, not all of them, they tend to be a little faster because you don't have the friction of two-way. Another thing about one-way streets, depending on the number of lanes that you have, one of the problems is that, especially if you're crossing at like a mid-block crossing or a place that doesn't have stoplights or stop signs, we call it like the multiple threat situation, where maybe that first car has stopped for you, but that second and third car have no idea why this person has stopped in the middle of the street, and they could zing by and they can't see you. So I guess those are a couple of things that come to mind
What
with
about
one-way streets.
You don't have to be worried about people coming from the other direction and get both directions clear before you cross.
Yeah, what's good about the car coming from the other direction is their sight lines of view are not blocked by that other car. So they can, pretend, right, I'm the person walking, this car can see me and this car can see me. What can't see me is that second car going in the same one way because the car is blocking me. So, yeah.
Are these costs that you have for the low and high estimates, I'm assuming that these are all based using existing right-of-way?
Correct, except for the plaza streets yes, all of it is existing right-of-way. So we are assuming that we are not expanding the streets and the right-of-way to make them wider. We're working within the existing right-of-way, but moving curbs. So that's the difference, yeah.
I was recently in a community where they had public restrooms in the middle of the streets where they had parking, they had perpendicular parking with 2 lanes of traffic on either side.
Oh, the middle of the street parking?
In the middle of the street. And then they also had diagonal parking for each direction of traffic.
Okay.
But then in the middle where the parking was perpendicular to the traffic, there were public restrooms. And there were trees, landscaping and the resting areas that you were talking about,
Okay.
and trash receptacles and bus stops and all that kind of stuff, which is, do you consider a part of the walkability of these areas to include public facilities so that,
I have not heard of the restrooms sort of in the middle of the street. Right. I'm like, well, that's a unique one. I would love to hear.
It was in Australia.
It was Australia. Okay. I'm like, wow, where is that? I would think of it too when we talk about a median. There are streets like that have that more parkway design where there is that wider space in the middle that you can program with all sorts of things. I know some communities get a little nervous about, having kids running around literally what feels like in the middle of the street and maybe darting out into traffic, but there's ways that you can design around that and such.
But with that parking, it does provide some calming effect on the traffic that's going through there.
Right, exactly, that friction.
You never know which direction there could be a car either backing out or.
Right. Yeah. Oh, interesting. The restrooms in the middle of the street.
Yeah, and they were clean.
Great.
So have you seen on a quick side note, have you seen the restrooms that are, they're on the public sidewalks, but they're clear glass?
Yes.
And there's the toilet inside and the sink and everything, and they're just clear glass. And then when you walk in, you shut the door, it all goes opaque. And so nobody can see in. I still wouldn't be comfortable using that, but anyway. Real quickly, the last thing we wanted to touch on, and we can get back to our conversation, was to really identify kind of another set of resources that the city has at their disposal to help make these things happen. Not only the public investments, but also the development side are all of these economic development tools that you have. Whether it's tax increment financing, whether it's supplemental taxes through the implementation of community improvement districts, business improvement districts, my favorite acronym, the SMID in Kansas, tax credits, whether it's low-income housing or new market tax credits, or just straight grants, equity investments. Something new that's coming out is something called the opportunity zones, which allow people to reinvest into distressed areas that are identified. And I believe Wichita's got quite a few, not quite a few, I shouldn't say that, but a big chunk of the ECA is under the opportunity zone designation. And really, we've kind of cataloged these, and we won't make you read all these up here, but this is on page 23 of the investment tab. And what we've done is identified them. A lot of these things you'll see you're already using in the ECA. I think our approach would be very strategic about the use of these things in creating walkable places and making sure that the infrastructure is there to support those through these different kind of economic development tools, and then further application of these areas throughout the ECA. Real quickly, I was going to read you our specific recommendations that are also in the economic or the public investment or the investment tab, which include creation of a land bank to target neighborhoods within the ECA that have high vacancy rates and abandoned properties, targeting the use of infrastructure-focused incentives such as TIFs, CIDs, special assessments, and those things to create those walkable areas, installing walkable infrastructure concurrently with development projects. So as you see development projects proceeding, what can we do to tie in public investment, public improvements into those to support those, and then promotion and the formation of the BIDs for that long-term maintenance and support of that new infrastructure, that repurposed infrastructure in the ECA. So with that, that's our entire presentation. Great conversation so far, and we'd be happy to continue to answer questions. I think we said we'd keep here till 3:30. Is that right? So.
Yeah, we don't want to leave early.
I've got a question that's probably more directed to staff than, but you, I'm sure, would be involved. What kind of stomach do our elected officials have for, I think they might be a little more amenable to enhanced zoning opportunities for our current zoning. But then starting to identify areas that, for implementation, do we have any kind of feedback? Have they been shown much of what we have seen? I'm assuming they've probably seen it.
Two council members here yesterday as part of the public. Actually, one of them is on the infill committee, and another councilman was here. Now, didn't get a lot of feedback exactly, and they're probably not going to do it right in that meeting, but that's a good question.
I think obviously the council's going to be traditionally has been more accepting of us providing greater options, which is one of the recommendations here is that, you know, there are a number of the types of development that we have existing in our existing neighborhoods that were it to burn down, get damaged, they could not rebuild what's there now because it doesn't meet the current development standards. And we don't have an approach other than going to the Board of Zoning Appeals and seeking a variance to allow something that's already there to be reconstructed. And these recommendations would give us the option to address that situation, but it also would allow people to come in and build something that matches what's already there, which you can't do now in a lot of respects. So I think, you know, we'll see. I would guess that the, you know, mandatory approach is probably not going to be all that well received, but we can have that conversation and find out. That's our intention.
Like I said, I think the enhanced zoning options in our current zoning code, I think that would probably have a little more would have a better likelihood of being approved.
Mr. Richardson.
What do you think about the idea of saying one area where we could apply this would be in, I don't know, areas or blocks that have a certain percentage of vacant lots, where we would say this, you know, we would allow this by right in, let's just say it's, pick a number, you know, 30% of the lots are vacant, and might also be in the opportunity zone. You know, those kind of two things together where you start. Because, I mean, unless we're looking at, absent Scott's example, which is obviously real, but not a lot of it, absent that, we're looking at where you're going to build, and that's going to be where there isn't something already, typically. We're not, as we talked about land values before, we're not in Wichita is not where you buy stuff and tear something down so you can build something else. It doesn't work economically to do that. So, could we use this, maybe even as a starting point to say, if we got a certain percentage of vacant lots in an area or a block or whatever, we want to encourage redevelopment by letting you do these kinds of things, where it'd be pretty non-controversial, if you would.
Yeah, that was my initial thought. Was you would potentially avoid. I don't know that you'd get 100% away from it, but you could potentially avoid some of the controversy.
Right.
However,
and
I think it would be a good way to target your incentive tools and your public investments to those areas. But with regard to the development itself and applying the zoning in that, the zoning changes in those areas, I still think the critical piece of that, and Chris can chime in here, but I think the critical piece of that is still understanding the context within which those vacant areas are currently set. Some of that context is obviously going to be removed, but you're still not going to want to go in and propose something that's wholeheartedly different than what's remains there.
But again, if you have a lot of empty lots in your area, it seems to me you might be much more amenable to having new things built. It's going to help your values as opposed to what we hear a lot of, which is going to devalue my property. It's
right.
Like if we get this developed, it's going to be better, it's more people, it's going to be safer, all those kinds of things. I think we might get acceptance better.
Right,
and especially if we go out and talk to these people, say, here's why we're doing this. We're
Yeah.
going to try to get redevelopment in your area, and maybe we do match that with new sidewalks, whatever, in those areas, because we got to do something to stimulate that development, and it has to be a sort of a mix of public and private. It seems to me the city's got to say it's put in, whether it's new curb and gutter or it's, because a lot of these areas have sidewalks, but they're not safe to walk on. Because a lot of it needs repair, and I realize that the adjacent landowner is responsible for that, but often it doesn't get done without somebody complaining about it. The city's not going to go out there and make them do it. So this might be one place to start, is areas where we have empty, and then we can marry that with opportunity zones and put some public investment in there. We might get some pilot projects that would maybe make some sense, because we're going to have to let people see this and see it work, and we need to maybe incentivize that in some way. Yeah, back to me again. Back to the land bank, experiences you have with those, do you see those even situations where sometimes they actually purchase land as opposed to receiving it because of tax foreclosures and those kinds of things?
Full disclosure, my experience with land banks is very minimal. Our market economic land bank expert on our team is not here today.
Okay.
But you do have on staff somebody who's very well versed in land banks. My experience, though, is that they typically assume property. They don't typically go out and buy it. But that's not to say that it can't or hasn't been done.
Well, just in terms of, land assembly might be helpful.
Right.
Okay.
I think it's more common the more common approach to land assembly and acquisition is what's called a community development corporation.
Yeah.
Land bank.
Do we have one of those?
There's several in Wichita, yeah.
That's what I
They
thought.
primarily build single-family housing with HUD subsidies.
Right, okay.
Any other questions? Thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate it. And
Thank you.
Any other business? If not, wait for it. We're adjourned.